Alisa Lynch is the Chief of Intrpretation, which is a very interesting title, but you got to look at things like a place like Manzanar, and how do we look at this place? That's all interpretation. Miss Lynch, please.
You know, it's really fitting that this pilgrimage is dedicated to Sue, and that we're honoring her on a stage where she stood so many times and in a place which held so much meaning in her life. You know, it was in 2001, ironically, during the week of September 11th, that I came to work at Manzanar and got to know Sue. I knew her for only the last 5 years of her life, but she became a daiji na tomodachi, a dear and treasured friend, who touched me in ways that will last a lifetime. Sue was 19 when she arrived at Manzanar on May 9th, 1942. Yet in many ways, the rest of her life echoed how she spent her time here. She was an educator, a patriot, and a writer. A week after she arrived, Sue volunteered as a teacher's aide with the Mary Knoll sisters, who were setting up a school in camp. 30 years later, she earned a master's degree in education. But you know, her education work was never limited to a classroom. She was integrally involved in all aspects of educating the public about Manzanar, and what you see here today in the Interpretive Center at this site and our programs is in a large part the result of Sue's passion for education. After volunteering as a teacher's aide, she took a job at the camouflage net factory that Rose mentioned. It was also one of the highest paying jobs in camp, so that might have had something to do with it. But it was a chance, again, to do her part for the war effort. And it's an early example of Sue making an active contribution to her country. Reflecting on Manzanar, she later said, "The biggest lesson I learned was that we were a group of people who had no power because we had no representation in Congress or in any governmental agency, and that if we really wanted to get our voices heard, then we had to be an active participant in a democracy." Sue's brand of patriotism, though, was never about mindless nationalism, but about keeping America on the right track. Whether it was the struggle for civil rights or workers' rights, or lobbying the state to place a plaque here as a landmark in 1972, or lobbying the federal government to create the National Historic Site in 1992, Sue was devoted to our country, and she fought to ensure that it would never again betray its citizens or its principles. And she often did this through her writing, another skill she developed in Manzanar, where she worked as a reporter and then later the editor of the Manzanar Free Press. She recalled, "My successful application for a job as a reporter marked a turning point in my life. I had always wanted to write. I learned that I had skills I had not been able to use or identify before. I enjoyed writing about activities in camp and the energy of the hard-working population. People's efforts to beautify their bleak surroundings lifted my spirits." For the rest of her life, Sue remained a prolific and impassioned writer. She wrote books, articles, essays, and was still writing long after her eyesight failed. Any of us who were her email pen pals will remember the 24-point type font that you would get messages from Sue and send them back. For all of these things, though, and more that Sue did at Manzanar during the war, she will always be remembered for what she did at Manzanar after the war. She said, "It was a cold and windy December day in 1969 when several hundred of us huddled together against the biting wind at the site of Manzanar to commemorate the human tragedy that had played out on the desert floor of the Owens Valley. It was her first trip back to Manzanar, and an experience that changed and in many ways defined the rest of her life. She became one of the first of her generation to speak out about Manzanar and the importance of keeping the memory alive to ensure that such an injustice would never be repeated. On this spot, 38 years ago, Sue found her calling and her voice, and it's because of that that we all gather here today. As the years go by, there will be fewer people who actually knew Sue, but everyone who comes to this place or even hears of Manzanar will be touched by her life and her legacy. She belongs to the ages now, but the work that she began here has to live on in all of us. She is a civil rights icon, but it's also important to remember that she was a very real person who knew triumph and heartbreak, who had a great sense of humor, and who did all of this while being a daughter, a sister, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, an aunt, a teacher, and a friend. Sue would be absolutely delighted to be honored here today, but I would think that she would think the greatest way to honor her is to stand up for what we believe in, to fight for what is right. We can best honor Sue and her legacy by honoring our own convictions to make this country all that it promises to be. どうもありがとうございました。